Alright, hello everyone. My name's Cheeto Dust. I'm in charge of the History Gaming panel. And welcome everyone here. I hope you guys are having a good time here at AnthroExpo 2021. I can't see the chat right now. I currently have everything blocked behind everything. But I currently have 60 minutes to get through about 60 years worth of gaming history. So I'm not going to waste anyone's time and just going to continue right along. Alright, so what is the first video game that's usually respond with, the Magnavox Odyssey and such? Which would be a good guess. Some people would say Pong, which is also a good guess. But actually the first games were created probably around 1962. Like I said, only 2 players. There is a moon in the middle of the game. So basically the way this game works, it's pretty simple. Here, let me pause this real quick. So the way this works is everyone starts on opposite teams. And this is the center of gravity, so both ships are currently being pulled towards the center. It's very similar to asteroids where you can direct your pod up and down, left or right. But as you can see, like this person right here is getting pulled very closely towards the moon. Oops, sorry about that. And this game was very revolutionary for 2 reasons. One, like I said, it was the very first game ever produced. And 2, it's actually the first game Nolan Bushnell actually played that actually inspired him to create Atari games. This game was kind of like, you weren't allowed to play it at MIT where it was made. It was kind of played secretly. It was the way Nolan explained is that they came to the computer rooms at night and had game sessions that went on all the way to the morning. Just a bunch of college students just sitting around having a good time. And that's pretty much how the first video game ever got produced. It was made in about 4 months, and it was actually made in... they actually don't know who created it. But what they do know is that it was made in 4 months, and it was made as a test on the MIT computers. So, going off of that, I'm going to start moving on to the actual consoles that were released for the homes. So starting first would be the Magnavox Odyssey. The Magnavox Odyssey was a very expensive for its time. As you can see right here, it was about $615 today, adjusted for inflation. The way it worked is it had two controllers, very similar to Pong. It had 2 controllers. This knob right here controls the horizontal, and this knob over here controls the vertical. And it pretty much plays exactly like Pong would, where you move it up and down, left and right. It actually came with, I believe, 12 games pre-installed on these chips right here. The games didn't have any names. They were just called game number 6, and you would just stick it in front right here, and it would automatically load the game. There was no power button on the console. As soon as you stuck that thing in, it would just start. And basically, when you start it up, these 2 little dots would show up. Now the dots, like I said, can move up, down, left, and right. The thing about the games, from all the games that they have on the console, is that they pretty much all play the same. Pretty much all the games involved the 2 little dots that the 2 players move around, and usually the reason for the chips is to program the 3rd dot that would do random things. Like, for example, the first game was obviously Pong, so it would just move like a normal Pong. The second game would be, I believe, was the football game. where the ball would actually move slowly, and you would actually have to play on a board. It actually came with like a little board to play like an actual football board game on, where the screen was just acting as like a visual sort. The Odyssey also came with a light gun controller, which was the very first gun light for the house, and it pretty much was similar to this. It was game number 13, I believe. You would just stick it in like normal, but the dots would actually move on their own, and it would just be like a normal target practice. And that's pretty much everything about the Magnavox Odyssey. It was a good start. But then a few months after that was Pong. The really cool thing about Pong is that on the very first day it was out as a prototype for people to play on, people to have a good time on. They didn't think it was going to do too well, but they were just sending it out there just to prototype. And then they got a call about 3 days later after it was first installed. And what actually happened was they had called out because the game wasn't working anymore. But what actually happened was when they pulled out all the mechanics, there was nothing wrong with the console. Instead, what happened was the coin slots was completely jammed because the coin catcher was just completely full of coins. So that really caught them by surprise. This game was produced in 4 months and it was actually training exercise by Alan Alcorn, as you see right here. The way this was actually the very first game produced by Atari Games, who would go on to create the Atari 2600, 5200, and pretty much a lot of arcade games, nowadays, such as Asteroids and such. But yeah, this was their very first console, and it was an overwhelming success. And this actually helped a lot for the video game industry, because this is the very first game that pretty much went mainstream. Now Nolan Bushnell, the guy who founded Atari, or one of the people, he actually also founded Chuck E. Cheese, and he did that because families back in the day didn't really understand the concept of a video game, and it was a very taboo concept for a lot of people back in the day. So the way he worked around trying to get people to play on the arcades was he wanted to make a place for kids, so the kids would play on the arcades while they're waiting for their pizza, because it takes 20 minutes for their pizzas to be ready. So during that 20 minutes, they can go play the arcades, and that's how he got a bunch of kids and adults to start playing arcade games, which was pretty smart of him. He pretty much, when Atari was sold to Warner in 1978, I believe, he sold all the assets, of course, for Atari and all that stuff, but they were Time Warner was not interested in the Chuck E. Cheese part of Atari games, so they actually let him keep it. And he actually did run it for quite a while. He ended up selling Chuck E. Cheese to a company in '93, I believe, and he pretty much went into retirement after that. I mean, he's still a very influential person. He did a lot for the video game industry. And one of those happens to be the Atari 2600. Now, when it first came out, the Atari 2600, it was not a popular system at all. It wasn't until they sold to Time Warner in 1978 is when it became a popular console. The major selling point of the console was that it was pretty much a way for arcade games back in that time to be played at the house. and that was pretty much the selling point for the Atari. That's why games like Space Invaders and Pac-Man on the Atari are pretty much the best sellers on the console, because those were the reasons why the console was made. The issue with the Atari is that they got very complacent, I would say. And by that I mean they were they they got the rights to Pac-Man, and they were just, oh, we can make this and ship it out, and everyone will just buy it. It's the bestseller. The problem with that is it led to very poor quality games, and eventually it led to stuff such as E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark and Pac-Man. Pac-Man was only made in 9 months by one person, and it was commissioned, so it didn't really care about how well the game was, just that it played. That's why Pac-Man, E.T., and Space Invaders are often credited with the video game crash that happened in 1983. It's because the quality of games just went down. People just didn't stop caring about games for a while. One of the games that also came out back in the day was Space Invaders. Sorry, I got a little off track with Atari. I just love talking about them. But Space Invaders was also a major popular game back in '78. It was released in Japan, and it actually was responsible for a shortage of coins when it first came out. This is the original arcade cabinet, and I know when you see Space Invaders games being played, it's usually a black screen that you normally play on, but this is actually how it looked in the arcades. It's being so the screen with the aliens is being projected onto a background, and that background is what you see as the big moon in the back. That's why I always suggest, if you ever play Space Invaders, play the arcade, because it looks so cool. The video doesn't do it justice. I promise, when you see that in real life, you'll be like, wow. But yeah, pretty much Space Invaders was another major hit in the arcades, and it pretty much spawned a bunch of other copycats or similar games because of that. Like, Asteroids is made to compete with Space Invaders, and Galaxian and Galaga, they were all made to compete with Space Invaders, because it was just such a popular thing in the arcades back in the day that everyone wanted a piece of the pie, pretty much. Now, the major hit in the arcades was Pac-Man, and that was for a number of reasons. I mean, the game's really fun. It was actually marketed towards females. That was the whole premise making the game, is that they wanted to make a game that appeals to the female audience, because it was very small in the arcades in this time. They wanted, when they made the game, they were just expecting it to be another, it's just another game. We can just make another one. But it turned into this very, very big phenomenon back in the day. It pretty much spawned a bunch of merchandise, and it actually created an album based on Pac-Man. And yeah, I mean, we still play Pac-Man today. It's a really popular game, and it's for a good reason. It's a very important game when it came out, and it's still an important game today. Now, going back to the video game crash, like I said, people were just overproducing really bad games. They were making a lot of copycats. They were making a lot of just rushed games, such as E.T. that you see right here. While E.T. is not the main cause of the video game crash, it was a major influence. So I can understand why people accredit it to the video game crash, but it's not the only reason. Like I said, there's there were too many. There were also too many consoles at the time, because at this time there were also a lot of Pong consoles. There was the Magnavox in television. There was the Double Vision that came out. All of these trying to compete with Atari. And in their rush to compete with Atari, they made a lot of copycats and a lot of bad games. That's pretty much why, like, when you see all these old games, they sell for pennies on the dollars, because, I mean, no one really cared about these games that came out. The Double Vision pretty much was the biggest one that survived the video game crash, but they left the video game industry pretty much after that, because it was just like, why continue if there's just going to be a shortage of people wanting to play games. But that leads me to my next point with Nintendo. The Nintendo Entertainment System, I would argue, is pretty much the whole reason why we still have video games today. The thing about the NES when it came out is, we were still suffering from the video game shortage at the time. So in order to get around that, Nintendo actually bundled the NES with the ROB, which you see right here. This is pretty much the original package it came in. The reason why it was done that is so that they can put it in the toy section and label it as a toy. Because, like I said, the big chain stores didn't want to carry video games because of all the poor sales of them. So Nintendo bundled it with ROB so it would be put in the toy aisle. That pretty much saved the video game industry, I would argue, because the NES would go along to sell a millions and millions of consoles, and Nintendo would produce pretty much what at the time would be AAA games on their system. I know Nintendo had a really, really strict third-party regulations, which included if you produce a game on the NES, they would own part of that game, which is pretty crazy to think about now, but this is still a new concept for them, and they were pretty much... The NES was pretty expensive also back in the day. Today it would be adjusted for $445. But, despite all that, it still managed to sell pretty well enough to survive all the way till 1995, which is pretty crazy. I know the Atari survived 15 years and was discontinued in 1991, which is pretty wild for game consoles to be having this long of a life. But this is pretty normal back in the day. One of the biggest selling games on the NES was Super Mario Bros. With Super Mario Bros. Being bundled in with pretty much all the NESs, it pretty much became one of the best-selling games without really trying. It really set the standards for how we see modern platformers and platformers as a whole. The game had smooth scrolling, which back in this day with PC gaming and the Sega Master System, this is pretty much the first one that set the standard for smooth scrolling and platforming. This game was very influential, and it's still I would argue, still pretty influential today. A lot of platformers, even till today, are pretty much modeled after this game, which just shows you it still stands to the test of time today. Also released just after the Super Mario Bros. Was the Game Boy. Now the Game Boy was pretty recognizable for a lot of really good games that came out for it. It was pretty cheap. I know $191 sounds like a lot, but this is during the time when the Atari Lynx and the Sega handheld came out at, I believe, $140, $130. So this is pretty much anyone could buy this. It launched with Tetris as the pack-in title for this game, which pretty much made the Game Boy and every person's console when it came out. They were originally going to release it with Super Mario Land, but they were faced with a dilemma where if they released it with Super Mario Land, it would be marketed towards little kids, but if they released it with Tetris, it would be a console for everyone. The Game Boy had the longest lifespan of any handheld console out there. It lasted all the way till 2003, which should show you how good of a console it is. There were a lot of really good games on it. The only issue with the original Game Boy is that it requires 4 AA batteries. The games pretty much required a built-in battery to save the games, which over time the battery begins to leak, causing the game to get corrupted or destroyed in that process. But overall, the Game Boy and their games is a pretty good lineup. I recommend it to anyone. And yeah. Now, Tetris, I want to come back to because it was a very revolutionary game when it came out, because it was made in the Soviets, the computer lab. So technically the person who made it didn't own it. It was owned by the USSR. But he, through a lot of loopholes and through a lot of negotiating, he was able to eventually own the game later in his life. But what I have to say about Tetris is that if you really like Tetris and want to learn more about its history, I would highly, highly recommend checking out the Game Historian's video on the history of Tetris. It's an hour long, and it goes pretty well into the story. It is a very interesting story, I promise you. You won't be disappointed. Now, in the middle of the NES's success, the Genesis also came out. The Genesis was made to... It was marketed as a way to have arcade quality games at the house, which is why it first launched with Altered Beast. It was pretty much to show that you can get arcade quality games at the house. It did a very good job at what it did, but at this time, the mascot for the Genesis was Alex Kidd. And I mean, does anyone really remember Alex Kidd? But this Sega actually held a competition in their headquarters for making a new mascot, and that's actually, pardon me going through here, that's actually where we got Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, Sonic the Hedgehog was very he was made to show that the system can go fast, because when the Super Nintendo was released, it outperformed the Genesis in a lot of ways. The only thing that the Genesis had over the Super Nintendo was it had a faster processor, and they used that a lot in their marketing. Sorry to skip ahead. I love talking about Sonic the Hedgehog. I could talk about him all day. But pretty much, Sonic was actually supposed to be a rabbit in this first concept. But it later came to a blue hedgehog. And actually the game was almost going to be centered around Dr. Eggman too. Eggman was actually supposed to be the main mascot, but he ended up becoming a villain. But yeah, that's pretty much how Sonic became. He was pretty much only made to show off the Genesis power and to be the official Sega mascot. Now, let me go back real quick to the Super Nintendo. A lot of people, when the Super Nintendo came out, did not like the system at all. And that's because it launched with Super Mario World, which before it came out, the newest Mario game was Mario 3. And a lot of people didn't like the Super Nintendo because they felt that game could be on the NES, and people were just felt like, why am I going to pay an extra $200 and such when I could just play Mario 3 and still have a good time? But with the slow sales, it eventually became more popular than the Genesis by a very narrow margin. But at the very end of the day, the Genesis did outsell the sales of the SNES worldwide, but domestically, the SNES outsold the Genesis. The Genesis had a lot of very popular games come out for it, such as Super Mario World and DKC. A lot of these games are still played today because of how good they are, and a lot of people consider this the golden age of gaming. A lot of people consider the Super Nintendo to be peak gaming at the time, and for good reason. A lot of the games are still pretty good to the day. Now we're getting into the Sega versus Nintendo. Super Mario World launch, and like I said, it didn't sell the way they wanted it to. They wanted Super Mario World to be like the it game where everyone wanted to buy it. But what actually happened was, like I said, nobody wanted to play Super Mario World because they already had Super Mario Bros. 3, so what's the point? And that's pretty much, I mean, now in hindsight, this is probably one of the better Super Mario games. But, I mean, back in the day, people were pretty hard-headed. Even my mother actually complained about having to buy a Super Nintendo at the time. It's pretty crazy. But Nintendo actually wanted to do CD games with their SNES, and they were actually planning on it. If you look on the other underside of the Super Nintendo, there's a thing where you can undo the thing and plop it on top of what was supposed to be the CD add-on. It got pretty far in development. The issue that came up was when Nintendo was relooking over their contracts with Sony and realized that Sony would actually have all the profits from the CD and the licensing. So anything that happened on that CD part, Nintendo would have very little influence on. The only thing they would have was the SNES games to sell. And that really irked Nintendo. So at the 1991 game show, they announced that they were partnering with Philips to produce the CD add-on. And of course, this is Sony just finding out about this, that Nintendo's suddenly partnering with their competitor, their biggest competitor. It was pretty much a big blow to Sony, but they took what they learned from the Nintendo PlayStation and made their own, which I'll get into later on. But this is also why we have Mario's Hotel and that Legend of Zelda game that's animated mostly. It came with the partnership with Philips to produce those games, and the CD add-on never came out for the Super Nintendo, so it's pretty much a waste of time for Nintendo to even attempt such a thing. While during all this time, while the SNES and the Genesis are fighting, a game came out called Street Fighter 2 in the arcades. It pretty much created what most modern fighting games do today, which, it's pretty much a testament to how good this game was when it came out. It was, how do I put this? It was very good in the sense that it was fast-paced action. The issue with the game was that it had a high learning curve, but a lot of people were actually willing to sit through it and play through it, obviously. But, there was actually 6 iterations of Street Fighter 2 that came out for consoles and in the arcades. So it got updated frequently, and it's still pretty much played today competitively, which is pretty good. And I'm gonna get a lot of flack with this because my roommate loves Doom. In '93, when Doom came out, all PC games up until this point were pretty much side scrollers. You know, they didn't have much progress. It was pretty much fly through a couple of things, collect. They were pretty much bare bones until Doom came out. Doom was pretty revolutionary. It was actually the second first-person shooter. Before this, it was Wolfenstein, which was also made by id Software, which they also obviously made this game. Doom was pretty influential because I believe John Carmack and John Romero eventually decided to release the source code for this game, which meant that anyone can make a game with the engine and sell it, which was pretty wild thing to do back in the day. But it paid off for them in the end with, you know, the release of Doom 2 and all the DLC actually for the first game. The first game was actually freeware, and I'm pretty sure you can still download it today, but it won't work on the modern systems. Doom was majorly influential because it pretty much showed everyone that PC gaming was very much still a thing, and that, you know, it eventually got ported to consoles, but they were not nearly as good as the PC port. It just goes to show you that PC gaming has come a long way, back all the way from the Doom era. Now, continuing along, in 1994, after learning all the stuff about the Sony or the Nintendo PlayStation, Sony went back to the drawing board, and while they were, still trying to produce the PlayStation 1, they were also trying to come up with a mascot, and they were still trying to figure that out all the way till after the console came out, because, you know, Nintendo had Mario, Sega had Sonic. Sony didn't really have a mascot up until the release of Crash Bandicoot. And actually, it actually didn't have dual analog sticks like you see here. It was just 8 buttons, 4 triggers for both sides, total, a start and select. And the buttons on the controller actually do mean something. The X and circle were supposed to be yes and no. The square was supposed to be for the map and such. And the triangle, I believe, was to bring up the menu. I could be wrong on that, don't quote me. But that's pretty much the idea they were going with the symbols on the buttons. And this is also one of the best-selling consoles ever produced. This is pretty much where Nintendo slowly started to become less popular. It really started with the Super Nintendo, but this is where it really kicked in, because Nintendo was pretty much used to being number one. So when they saw the PlayStation 1 and how well it sold, they were pretty much taken aback. And I'm sure in hindsight they regretted it, not signing up with the deal that they made with the Super Nintendo. But, you know, the PlayStation 1 had some pretty revolutionary games on it as well. A lot of these games that you see right here are still going on to this day. It pretty much shows you that a lot of the PlayStation 1 games ended up becoming some of the best games we've played even to today. So, Crash Bandicoot was actually made by Universal. It went through a lot of development. A lot of pre-builds of the game were in 2D, but Sony was actually pressuring them to make a lot of the stuff 3D in that game. Like the map was originally 2D. It used a lot of 2D assets, which is why the game today, when you play it today, it really hasn't aged too well. I mean, it's still playable. Don't get me wrong. It just doesn't look as good as it would if it was mostly 2D. And actually, there was supposed to be a Crash cartoon, but Sony actually nixed that because they wanted to focus on the 3D, because 3D was this big thing that was exploding during this time period, which actually leads me to the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 was actually supposed to release a full year before it actually did. It was pretty much stuck in development hell, but that was mostly due to Super Mario 64 taking a lot of development time. And a lot of that development time was mostly spent on the camera, getting the camera right. Now, as you can see, it wasn't the best selling Nintendo console. But it had some of the most influential games as well on here, such as Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, which Ocarina of Time is still one of the best games ever released, and that's with all the high ratings and all the praise it's received. It was pretty much the best console for a lot of people, but in Nintendo's eyes, they actually saw the 64 as a failure, and that's because of the console sales. And Nintendo wasn't really happy with the sales, and that's also why it was discontinued so soon. It's because they just wanted to move on and forget that the whole thing even happened, which kind of sucks. I'm not gonna lie. But moving on to Super Mario 64, honestly, if it was up to me, I would spend this entire panel just talking about this game, because this probably has the most interesting development for any game I've probably researched. A lot of this game was pretty much trial and error. It was a lot of 3D platformers, and this time they had a fixed camera. Like when you play Crash Bandicoot, the camera's fixed, so you cannot move it. So it's always fixated no matter where you're moving. This game was pretty much revolutionary because you could take the camera wherever you want. You could pretty much go wherever you want. You weren't restricted on your movement. And it was a really taxing game, because this game was made in less than 2 years, which put a lot of stress on the developers. As a matter of fact, this is pretty much why Shigeru Miyamoto is now relegated as an assistant now. It's pretty much because he pretty much got burnt out on directing games because of this game. But I'm sure he still appreciates all the hard work that his team and himself put into this game. If you ever have any spare time, I'd highly recommend looking into the history of this game, because it's pretty interesting, and it still has a pretty active speedrun as well to this day. Now, Final Fantasy VII also came out about a year or half a year later. It pretty much blew everyone's expectations when it came out. They were actually planning Square to release it on the N64, but it would have required a lot of resources to even run it, which is why it became a PlayStation exclusive, because they could hold the CDs for the PlayStation can hold a lot of information. Nintendo was still being stubborn using cartridges with the N64. It's pretty much because they wanted to keep the piracy under control for that console, because they weren't sure about CDs, because they were, people can buy a CD writer and write a game. We're going back to Final Fantasy VII. This game became very influential because it had an amazing story. It pretty much introduced the world to what they call a JRPG. Final Fantasy was doing it to modded success, but this is the game that brought it to the mainstream. Um, this game this game sold a lot of copies for being released in the middle of the PlayStation's life, and it just got a remake about a year ago. If that tells you how good of a game it is. Now, after that game came out, Ocarina of Time was another very influential game to come out for the N64. Uh, it was pretty much in development for about 5 years till it finally came out. This game was being produced alongside Super Mario 64, which is why a lot of influences, the Mario and Zelda teams drive a lot of influence with each other. That's why Mario 64 has a lot of puzzles. And that's also why a lot of ideas also get transferred between the two games. One of the big reasons why Ocarina of Time was so influential is because it was an open 3D world where you can go explore, you can go talk to town folks, you can do pretty much whatever you want, like in Mario 64. But it was an open world RPG where you can just talk to people and do quests and such. It is and still is pretty highly regarded as one of the best video games ever made. And while the N64 doesn't hold up well today, it's still an amazing story and a game I'd highly recommend for a lot of people. It's still a very influential game by today. Now, the Dreamcast, when it came out, Sega was already struggling, but that's because they were coming off the sales of the Sega Saturn and the Sega Dreamcast, or sorry, the Sega Saturn and the Sega 32X. And those sold very poorly, mostly because the biggest problem with Sega at the time was that they just kept releasing new consoles within like a 2-year span. Like the Sega CD came out 2 years, and then after that the 32X came out 2 years. Then the Sega Saturn came out less than a year after the 32X. So a lot of consumers lost a lot of faith in Sega, which is pretty much why the Sega Dreamcast sold so poorly. It was because people were under the mindset of, oh, well, in another 2 years there's going to be another Sega console, so why bother? Unfortunately, that also did lead to the downfall of Sega. There was a lot of trial and error with Sega, and a lot of infighting that went on, which is why Sega of America and Sega of Japan they weren't really on the same connection. Like in North America, they would beg Japan to let them do something, and they would be forced to do it their way, which was pretty silly mistake on Sega's part in hindsight. But yeah, the Sega Dreamcast was discontinued shortly after due to poor sales, and Sega eventually became a third-party developer for the GameCube, the PlayStation, and the original Xbox, and they're still making third-party games to this day. Now, before they went under, they released Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2. The adventure games were seen as a step up from the normal games that were being released at the time, but they weren't seen as this like must-have game when it came out. A lot of people, when this game came out, just relegated it as just another Sonic game, because at this time the latest Sonic game to come out was Sonic R, and it was very a lot of the Sonic games before then were received very poorly, which is 2.5 million copies sold is not a lot, but it's actually the best selling game on the Dreamcast. Um, which is eventually why the Dreamcast became discontinued so shortly after. But this game also did include DLC through the internet port in the back of the Dreamcast, which was pretty revolutionary for the time. Um, I mean, nowadays we have DLC day one on a lot of our games, but the DLC for this game was free, and this pretty much laid the groundwork for DLC moving forward for some games. Um, One of the biggest killers of the Dreamcast was the PlayStation 2. This is still considered one of the best consoles ever made, and there was a lot of really good games that came out for this console. It is actually still the best selling console of all time. Uh, this game, or sorry, this console sold. It's pretty much how it is with the PlayStation 5 right now, where it was just sold out everywhere when it came out. It took years for this game or for this console to be in stock normally, but this was pretty much a major step forward for 3D gaming. Um, while it might be the weakest of the three consoles that came out during this time, it was still cheap enough and popular enough to continue all the way. The last game that was produced for this console was actually in 2018, which should show you how popular this console was. Um, the the PlayStation 2 also came with the dual analog stick, which is pretty much still used in all the Sony consoles to this day. They really haven't changed much for the design. They've pretty much the only thing that's changed is the middle button, but that was for changing it to analog controls. Um, that's why if you look at a PlayStation 3 or they all look. I changed the PlayStation to this. It was controversial when it came out, and it was actually pretty smart on Rockstar's part because they used that controversy just to push more games. Um, I believe when that game came out, it was actually pulled off the shelves and forced to be have their ratings changed to rated A because there was a hidden section on that game where you could have fornication, but it was removed before the final game came out. But people managed to unlock it with Game Genie and such, and because of that, the ESRB forced them to change the rating to rated A, which is why the game got pulled and recalled, and um, that also influenced, like I said, the controversy with the game. But it's still a surprisingly good game. I've played it recently, and it still holds up pretty well. A lot of the jokes actually still hold up pretty well with the game. Um, Moving on. Um, well, the original Xbox also came out during this time, and its packing title was Halo. And Halo was really popular because it was pretty much this sci-fi thing that was multiplayer. It had a local multiplayer, a really fun local multiplayer, and a campaign that was actually pretty. Um, it was it was originally going to be a real time strategy game, but through I through a lot of process, it eventually became a first person shooter, which I'm sure Microsoft is very grateful for. Um, Halo was influential because it was a really fun party. Mainly the reason why the game caught on the way it did. The this just kept adding on to that local multiplayer. Big, massive first person shooters became as popular as they are today. Halo and Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare really perfected the first person genre. And I mean, Halo's still being produced to this day. Uh, it's actually not being produced by the original people. They left to create Destiny. Uh, but their influence is still going on even into the Halo. So I'm sure the team behind the game would be pretty happy with what they've made. And now, the GameCube was actually the last console released during this time, and it's going to be the last console I talk about because I have not too much time left. But the GameCube was also seen as a failure to Nintendo because of the poor sales. But it also had some of the best games Nintendo's ever produced. Like Melee still has a very competitive scene. Sunshine is still widely considered one of the best 3D platformer Mario games. And the controller for the GameCube is probably, in my opinion, the most comfortable controller there is out there. It was actually codenamed the Dolphin, and Shigeru Miyamoto actually wanted the GameCube to be called the Nintendo Dolphin before it was shot down. Because it was, I mean, do you want to play on the Nintendo Dolphin? I mean, come on. But it also introduced, a lot of new titles, such as Chibi Robo and such. It didn't sell well, and that's mostly because the popularity of the PlayStation 2 was just, it outshined the Xbox and the GameCube side, that it wasn't even a close competition, which is a really big bummer because, like I said, there's a lot of good games on the GameCube, which is why the games, when you try and buy them today, are very expensive. But yeah, that's pretty much where I'm going to end today's stream. If you have any questions about any of the games I've talked about, feel free to reach out to me. And if you have any suggestions for games I should cover, just shoot me a message, and I'll make an updated version of this list. But with that being said, thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your AnthroExpo 2021. Thank you all very much.